So as of yesterday, the Trump administration is moving a very large force of U.S. Marines and sailors into the Latin American and Caribbean theater. U.S. Southern Command, also known as SOUTHCOM, is deploying about 4,000 troops into the region. In addition, there's a whole fleet of U.S. naval assets joining them, including a nuclear-powered attack submarine, several destroyers, a guided missile cruiser, and a bunch of reconnaissance aircraft too. It is quite a large and menacing force, but the reason they are going into that region is rather interesting. Now, on the surface, this all has to do with Trump's declaration of a state of emergency regarding the fentanyl crisis. Because there's been an increasing amount of fentanyl added to street drugs that Americans consume, this has been very dangerous to those consumers of drugs, and many of them have overdosed or died in the last few years. Shortly after entering office, Trump signed an executive order declaring a state of emergency based on that fentanyl in order to be able to deploy extraordinary assets against that threat. He's basically positioning this fentanyl in the drugs as a strategic national security threat rather than a law enforcement issue, which it has been viewed as in the past. Now, we've all heard of Mexican drug cartels. We all know they're crazy violent, and we all know that tens of thousands of people have been killed by these cartels in recent years. We also are mostly aware that a lot more cartel operatives are operating deeper and deeper inside the United States and assuming control of more organized crime. So to call it a national security threat is not exactly a stretch. You can definitely make the case that it is some kind of national security threat. However, in my very extensive conspiratorial and counter-narrative research, which I've been doing for years, I've never seen that the US government cares very much about a bunch of drug addicts in America. Quite the contrary. Organizations like the CIA, Mossad, and MI6, which basically operate as a shadowy axis of power behind the scenes, have more often than not been managing these international drug flows, not just from Mexico to the United States, but all over the world. They have their hands in that cookie jar, and they have for a long time. As a matter of fact, that is a way these intel agencies get a lot of black funds to extend their reach much further without oversights from the governments that they serve, and create different networks and webs of influence throughout other governments and essentially control much of Western politics. Behind these agencies is a lot of dark money, and a lot of that dark money comes from drug trafficking. So to suddenly make it a big deal that there's a bunch of kids in the United States overdosing on fentanyl, it just doesn't add up, because the US government has never cared about drug addicts. It has always pretended to, and yet it's never done anything effective in order to counter that problem. On the contrary, they benefit tremendously from maintaining a flow of drugs into the United States and all over the world, because, as I said, they have compromised a lot of that trafficking and they earn money on it. So because it's not at all plausible that the United States government and its military suddenly care so much about the lives of American children that they are threatening to go to war against international crime organizations like the heavily armed drug cartels of Mexico, what is actually going on? Only recently, the president of Venezuela, whose name is Maduro, had a bounty on his head doubled from $25 million to $50 million. This only happened last week. Now, that's a lot of money, but the reason he had that bounty on his head already is even more interesting. Back in 2020, he was indicted in a court in New York for allegedly sitting atop an international drug trafficking ring that was lacing cocaine bound for the United States with fentanyl in order to intentionally kill Americans. So therefore, he was considered to be not only a drug kingpin, but a kind of terrorist who was infiltrating and operating on US soil and targeting American citizens. Now, Maduro, of course, has vehemently denied those accusations. And I have to say, it doesn't really make much sense that a president of his own country would meddle in something like international drug trafficking rings and threaten his legitimacy as the head of a government, when he could obviously have other people doing that for him and simply take some kind of kickback, which is what government officials typically do, not just in corrupt and struggling nations like Venezuela, but even very developed nations like the United States. This is normal, it happens all over the world, and everybody knows about it. It is very rare that politicians actually get their hands dirty doing things like this. They will normally have a few degrees of separation. Even when they are involved in things like this, they will never be directly involved. So the idea that the president of an entire country would get involved directly with drug trafficking to the point where he is being called essentially a cartel leader is very extraordinary and very unusual, and in my opinion, not plausible at all. So now let's fast forward to today, where just recently, like I said, only a week ago, Maduro had the bounty on his head doubled by the Attorney General of the United States, Pam Bondi. She made this bold statement about bringing Maduro to justice and protecting American children, and then announced this massive reward. Now, I believe there is absolutely no intention whatsoever of the US government to pay anybody that reward except quite possibly themselves. And I will tell you exactly what I think is actually happening. By labeling Maduro as a drug cartel leader, and then separately signing executive orders saying that the military is going to go after cartel leaders, what they are really doing is authorizing military action against the sitting head of a government. So why would they want to deploy military force against a government like Venezuela? What did Venezuela ever do to us? Well, they didn't really do anything to us. It's all about what they have, which is a shitload of oil. Venezuela actually has the largest proven reserves in the entire world, actually even far exceeding Saudi Arabia. Because they have those tremendous reserves, there's already a target on their back. However, when the previous president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, took over, he implemented a socialist dictatorship and nationalized these oil wells, which were being managed by American companies. From that point on, the Venezuelans didn't really have enough knowledge or sophisticated equipment and training to manage those oil wells, which has collapsed their energy sector to a large degree. But the oil is still there. It is still available for companies and countries who have the means to go and get that oil. However, obviously, the Venezuelan government is in the way. So when you understand the way the United States operates, which is basically a mafia, an international criminal cartel that is constantly going around the world, creating wars, stirring up conflict, planting false flag operations, and all that, in order to gather resources through extraction after they have taken out the people in the way, it makes a lot of sense why now what we are seeing is actually an operation for regime change in Venezuela. Now, most people, especially on the right wing, because they love Trump and they're just fanatical about the guy, it seems like they are very much in support of the US military going after drug cartels. Because like I said, we all know that drug cartels are very criminal. We know they're extraordinarily violent, and we know that they cause a lot of harm to the United States. So for a lot of people, it will feel good about taking our very talented and very well-resourced military and sending them against these international criminal organizations. However, I think you guys are dreaming. I don't think that's going to happen because there has never been a very high priority placed on interdicting drugs and preventing drugs from being consumed by Americans. So this heroic sounding mission to save the lives of US children from drugs is really just a cover in order to cloak a hidden secret agenda. And that agenda, in my opinion, is very likely to be regime change in Venezuela for the purpose of accessing its vast oil reserves. Something that Trump has been on a tear doing since he took office the second time around is securing things like minerals, rare earths, and energy. These are very high priorities for the US administration this time around. The United States does have a significant amount of oil. It is one of the biggest oil producers in the world, and it has a very substantial amount of natural gas. However, something Trump's been doing as he's been implementing tariffs to other countries all over the world is forcing them to buy American energy products. For the most part, that has been natural gas. And because we have an abundant amount of both oil and natural gas, and we are securing customers all over the world by placing very heavy tariffs and sanctions on them, if they don't buy natural gas and oil from us, it makes all the sense in the world that the United States and its partner corporations would be very ambitious about going out into the world and finding new sources to steal, because that is the way the US empire operates. So to reiterate, what I think is that there's going to be no serious operations against drug cartels in Mexico. I think you will see some very hollow made-for-TV victories, probably a few direct raids on certain key figures and maybe some high-profile arrests, and a bunch of photos of a bunch of drugs being seized around Latin America and the Caribbean. However, I think all of that is basically a ruse. It is going to be stuff that's plastered all over the news to make people feel really good about using our military in ways that are inappropriate and unconventional. While in reality, the real operation going behind the scenes and the real reason you have things like a nuclear-powered attack sub being deployed against drug cartels, because they're not going to be going after a bunch of drug cartel members running around the Sinaloa desert in their stolen American 4x4s with ancient AK-47s. I don't believe that at all. What I believe is that the real mission is going to be executing regime change in Venezuela, installing a dictator there that will be much more friendly to the United States and will allow American companies to go in and drill that oil. What will happen more than likely, in addition to that, is some kind of oil for security arrangement, just like the one that was recently made with Ukraine. This is not very big news, but only recently, a couple months ago, the United States made a deal with Ukraine, and the terms of the deal are not good for Ukraine. Basically, they said, we are going to pull the plug on all the weapons and armament and money that we've been providing you for years. You didn't win the war against Russia, so now you're cut off. If you want to continue us funding your war, you have to pay for it, and the way you can pay for it is by giving the United States access to their minerals and rare earths, which Ukraine has an abundance of. The rare earth and mineral content just in Ukraine alone is estimated to be worth $15 trillion at today's prices. And minerals like lithium and rare earths have been determined to be so strategically important to the United States that the Department of Defense actually bought a 15% stake in the only company that has the capacity to mine and process rare earths in the United States, called MP Metals. So you have the United States government placing a strategic level of importance. Strategic meaning this is fundamental to national defense, and evidently so important that the Pentagon is investing directly into taking an ownership stake in private companies. That is not how the private free enterprise market is supposed to work. However, under Trump, you are going to see a lot more of that. The United States is going to increasingly take direct ownership stakes in private corporations and make sure they succeed by calling it national security. What it really is state-run capitalism or fascism, however you want to define those words, but we certainly don't have a free market economy any longer in the United States. With all that being said, what I believe is likely is a military action against Venezuela to take out President Maduro after labeling him a drug kingpin and acting like he's the head of some massive international cartel, then install some new president, have some kind of sham elections, and say the Venezuelan people are finally free from this horrible, evil dictator, and now they democratically elected a way better president. But in reality, the purpose of that new president will be to give American companies access to that oil, which America will then take, refine, and sell to other countries, which it has been forcing to buy our oil and our natural gas as a component of the trade deals that Trump has been making left and right ever since he took office this year. And if you don't believe me that that's what's happening, consider this one last thing. Maduro is one of the only leaders in the world who openly and blatantly claims that the United States is run by a Jewish mafia. And that is something that no world leader is allowed to say, because all world leaders who have ever said that publicly have been removed from power, sometimes killed, sometimes overthrown in a revolution or a war, and sometimes simply outvoted in some kind of corrupt elections. The leader that I remember most recently saying literally that exact phrase was the President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, also known as AMLO. He said that a couple years ago. It was published in the news, and what do you know? He was replaced as president, not by anybody, but by a Jewish female president, and only after the bloodiest election season in Mexican history, where basically all the other candidates were assassinated. So you have Maduro speaking out about who really controls America, which no one's allowed to say. You have Maduro sitting atop the world's largest proven oil reserves and not tapping into them. You have Maduro also being labeled as some kind of drug kingpin, even though he's repeatedly denied that, and it really doesn't make much sense at all that he would be. He is labeled as that and has a $50 million bounty on his head. And finally, you have the US military being deployed into that exact region on a mission to take out drug kingpins. It's not that hard to put together, guys. So keep your eyes peeled for that, because I think there is a very long-standing historical pattern about to repeat itself, which is American military forces going into a country, tearing it up, killing a shitload of people. Also, US corporations can get very, very rich. And while the American population is being pummeled with a narrative about how we're bringing democracy to new parts of the world, when in reality, it's always only about one thing. And you guys know what that is: money.